Welcome to the Resilient Butterfly Podcast. My goal is to share inspiring stories of healing and recovery through many diverse approaches and models. Our guests bring incredible lived experiences, insights, and/or professional expertise, each with their own unique path. While we highlight and celebrate these stories, our intention is to inform, inspire, and demonstrate resilience and creativity. This podcast does not endorse any one approach. We believe there is more than one way to heal, and we're here to showcase the resilience and possibilities that exist. Thank you for coming to Resilient Butterfly Podcast. We are so grateful that you are listening today. I have a really special guest today, Alisa Fliss, who is currently a treatment placement specialist at Acadia Healthcare, where she's worked for the past 12 years in many capacities, and we'll go through that later. But while going to treatment in 2006 at Renfrew for an eating disorder, Alisa was asked to be in a documentary, Thin, that was filmed with Alisa and other patients at Renfrew. This film documented the disease of all of the food addictions, but did not show the recovery of the patients. And I said to Alisa, I need you on this podcast. We need to talk about hope for and resiliency and recovery of this food disease. If you listen to the Resilient Butterfly in the past, you know that we're not talking about the disease, but we're talking about hope, resiliency, and recovery, and not staying in the disease state. And so, Alisa, I want to start out with thanking you, first of all, for coming and sharing your story and your hope of recovery for people who are in a disease of eating disorder. And for you to start out with, at what age and when did you start seeing some of the symptoms of an eating disorder? Did you recognize them at first, or did you just think everything was okay?
So first of all, I want to thank you for having me. And as far as recognizing the signs, I don't know that I did. I really think back. I was raised, I come from a Jewish family. I went to Hebrew school, and I feel like actually dieting was such an integral part of that culture. I remember from a very young age really receiving these mixed messages that there are two things that you need in life, and that is money and good looks. And I had neither. So, I
beg to differ.
No, I actually have a lot of compassion for myself when I look back at, I almost look at myself as, I'm able to look at that little girl and almost see her as another person, almost as if my own, I see that in her child. But I would say, from a very young age, I remember always hearing the word potential. Potential. If Alisa ever lost weight, she would be beautiful. She would have so much potential. And what does that mean? What is potential? Potential for greatness, potential for brilliance. I was always very highly academic, highly creative, very different on the sense, though. I was an introvert in a very extroverted family. And so while I may have been laughing on the inside because I wasn't laughing loud on the outside, it was always, why are you so unhappy? Why are you so unhappy? And I really wasn't unhappy. But I did struggle with weight from a young age. And and sometime around the age of 6 or 7, my mother had taken me to the pediatrician, I think for an ear infection. And the pediatrician said, what are you going to do about your daughter's weight? And my daughter was like, what's wrong with her weight? And he said, she's fat. And at that point, they had me start seeing a dietitian. And I remember getting this Snoopy notebook, and every week I would come back. I was on a 1,000 calorie diet at the age of like 6 or 7 years old. I would come back, and if I lost weight, I would get to put a sticker in the notebook. And if I didn't lose weight, then I didn't. So somewhere around, I was at summer camp, probably somewhere around the age of 12, prepubescent, and a lot of that weight just came off naturally. But what I recognized was how different I was treated when that weight came off. It was like, oh, Alisa's so beautiful. All of a sudden, anybody who ever teased me was now my best friend. Any boy on the playground who teased me was now interested in
At
me.
what age was this?
This was probably around like 12, 13 years old. Was now interested
Which
in
is
me.
a very vulnerable age for a young girl.
Right, exactly. So a lot of really mixed messages. Within my own family, my father, may he rest in peace. He passed away of COVID in 2020. My sister and I remember till this day, he was definitely a foodie. He struggled with his weight. He did everything from wiring his mouth shut to try to lose weight. And in hindsight, he was bulimic. And I remember
who
hearing
wired
that.
his mouth shut?
I
Dentist?
guess a dentist. My parents got divorced when I was very young, when I was three. And I remember for years people saying, did that divorce have any effect on you? And I always said, nope, I was too young to understand. But now in hindsight, I recognize how.
Wow.
So I was parentified from a very young age and always felt responsible for taking care of everybody else, taking care of my mother, taking care of my father, taking care of everybody else in my life. I've always been just a very, very empathic person. So somewhere around middle school, junior high, 13, 14, 15, really, so started dieting at a young age. And I would say that while that didn't meet the diagnostic criteria, I was always on a diet. I remember going to my mother and saying, if I could just lose weight, I would be happier. So I remember signing up for Nutrisystem, if you could remember that, all the way back, like in the early 80s. And then it seemed to be normal to take diuretics and laxatives. Even my younger sister had a friend who was anorexic and from probably around the age of like 13 had gone to treatment. And again, I heard my stepmother and my father saying, boy, we wish we had her willpower. And I remember thinking about that. And she had just come out of treatment. We had her in the car with us. She was so furry. As, she was, emaciated. She had come out of treatment and she had that lanugo that so many anorexics, she was covered, like from head to toe. And it was so sad, but I just kept thinking like, I should have that willpower. And I think from there, it sort of escalated. Again, I don't think
the willpower wasn't about going to treatment. The willpower was about staying thin?
It was about staying thin. It was always, if I could just stay thin, what if I had the willpower to not eat this, or if I had the willpower. So fast forward, I was college bound and got this brilliant idea. It was like, where am I going to go? I didn't have a lot of direction. I was applying to colleges and I had decided that I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. It was it was a sort of a impulsive decision.
So I want to stop there for a second and ask you, you came from a Jewish family and you wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. Well, what
isn't that what all nice young Jewish girls from South Florida do? They enlist in the military during a war.
I needed to figure this one out.
Like during
myself.
Desert Storm,
just don't seem like
and with divorced parents, my mother was like, "It's wonderful, the benefits," and my father was like, "Oh, I'm going to kill the recruiter who allowed her to do this." But I wanted
Was this an escape for you, do you think?
I think it was an escape. I had seen a movie that I was inspired by at the time. What was it, like G.I. Jane with Demi Moore? One of those movies. And I'm like, I could do that. And then, but I think it was also in my head, I thought, I needed somebody to keep me in line. I needed like somebody to force me
structure.
to live a rigorous lifestyle. And the military could do that. I mean, I'm going to be forced to run 5 miles a day or how, no. So, so I enlisted in the military, and I enjoyed it. I learned so much from that experience.
Did you go out of the country?
I did. I was stationed in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which was a big shock. I did some training in Texas. I went through the police academy down in Texas. I trained with the Army in New Jersey. And then the first place I was stationed was Cheyenne, Wyoming. I got married. I did the military thing. I got married very, very young. I was 18 years old, had my son at 19. I always said I wouldn't have children until I was like 30, 35. I didn't know if I would ever get married. Went to Germany and was coming up upon my reenlistment, had just reenlisted, had gotten a position on the USAFE Elite Guard. That's the United States Armed Forces in Europe, Elite Guard, which was very prestigious. I would have been following dignitaries, the dignitaries that came to Europe. And at that point, I'll go back just a little. I was in a very volatile relationship. So it was, there was a lot of volatility there. At the point, I had to actually send my husband back to the United States. And at that point, I think that's when the eating disorder really escalated. I started.
And you had one child at that time?
I had one child at that time, my son. And he was my world. I was working full time. I was in the Air Force. I was going to school part time. I was raising my son. And at that point, I started to not binge and purge, but I was restricting. I started restricting, and then I would purge, and then I started seeing a therapist over. And this is where back then, we're
So
going
would
on.
you think that that's the first time that you recognized it? Or?
So I think that's where I was first diagnosed. Okay. So I think I struggled for about 17 years in total. But at that point, what was very interesting is just how little people knew about eating disorders. Because the therapist that I was seeing, when I was explaining to her, I said, well, this is what I do. I try not to eat. And then if I do, I purge. And she's like, oh, you're bulimic, so you binge. And I said, well, what do you mean by binge? And she said, and then she explained it to me. She defined binging. And I thought, well, why would I sit here and struggle and starve myself if I can eat whatever I want and still lose weight? And it was almost a therapist who planted this seed in my head. So at that point, it had gotten out of control, and I hadn't started my new position yet. And there was an intervention between the, I came home one day, and in my apartment was the chief of police, who I was good friends with, him and his wife, and he was in tears. It broke my heart. And they said, we don't know what to do. And I'm so sorry, but we're going to have to hospitalize you. So I was hospitalized at that point.
At that point, do you remember how much you weighed?
I was not, and I think this is where the misconception comes into place. I was not significantly, I had lost a tremendous amount of weight, but I was not underweight. And part of my recovery is not talking about weight, because it confuses people into thinking that you have to look a certain way. And you have people who are overweight, and because they're binging and they're purging, they're dying and they're at risk of cardiac arrest. And then you have like chronic anorexics who live their entire life emaciated and are at less risk. So,
well, let me ask you this.
Yes.
How did your friend, the chief of police, when you were not underweight, you were not visibly underweight, how did he recognize that you had an eating disorder?
It was still a significant weight loss in a short period of time. And
Got
the
it.
therapist that I was seeing did
Okay.
report it. And they knew that I was exercising, and they knew that I was restricting, and that I had started binging and purging.
I ask these questions because there's so many people out there that are going to pick up on some of the information you're sharing.
Yeah. Yes. So one of the reasons, and I know we're going to get to the documentary, but post-documentary, I was actually asked to do an interview I met with a reporter for the Sun Sentinel. And she said, and this was probably 6 months into my recovery. And she said to me, it's funny because she goes, what was your lowest weight? Because you don't look like you have an eating disorder. And I was so shamed by that. And I went home and I was like looking for pictures that I can show her from when I was underweight. And then I realized, and I stopped myself and I said, I don't have to prove to anybody, nor will I. And I will not I was in the documentary, and I was nominated for an Emmy, and I was on the Today Show and Good Morning America and several, and CNN. And I realized that it was about recovery. And I remember I sort of got into it with the producer several years after the documentary. And I said, every time you want to talk about I'm done talking about the gory story, as we put it. And they're like, but that's what sells, Alisa. I said, people are going to buy whatever it is that you put on the front of that magazine. You have the potential to, you determine the message. You determine what these young girls see out there. And I said, I will not do another interview unless we talk about, rather than the depths of my story, but rather the recovery.
And when I watched, when I watched the documentary, the entire documentary, as well as the ending, just showed everyone still having a disease, not in any type of recovery or look like any part of that. So it looked like patients were in there getting treatment, but not getting well.
Right.
And my sense, that was how many years ago was that documentary?
So it was filmed in 2004. So 25 years ago, in June is when I went to treatment. And it premiered I think in November of 2006.
So I could be wrong, but are people not looking for any type of recovery now, 25 years later? You think that the public wants to see only
the sensationalism,
the devastation that people go through?
I truly believe that if done well, people can show a documentary and show recovery. I think what happened with the documentary, and this is where I think, because everybody says, why would a treatment center do this or open their doors? And I think it was because they wanted to be able to show the good work. They wanted to be able to show that people do recover. But what they wanted to show as well is that how devastating eating disorders could be. Now, HBO wanted to show just how devastating eating disorders could be. But again, in order to sell that documentary, and they focused on the drama and the sensationalism. And I think, how do you show both how devastating the eating disorder is in such a dramatic way that HBO felt that they needed to do it, but yet show recovery?
Could they do a part two?
I think they could.
A follow-up part two?
Right, like where are they now?
Recovery.
Exactly.
Thin to recovery.
Right. So I think that they could. And so I think it was a big shock when it came out. Also, it was a big shock to me. They flew in prior to my actually seeing it at Sundance and showed it to me. And I was like, I was a little surprised, because if you think about it, they took 200, 300 plus hours of footage, cut it up, and edited it to create a story in an hour and a half. So So there's a lot that that I wish, at least for my part, that you would have seen.
I hope that
Um,
someone does another documentary of healing and recovery and eating disorders. And and the same thing with the intervention show, having a follow
yeah,
up to that. I had someone, I think you may have listened to that particular podcast where she was intervened by Dr. Phil on the show, and now she's in full recovery
yeah,
with 3 children, beautiful children, and she was pregnant on heroin at the time. More and more of those stories need to be talked about because there's so many people out there that don't try to get their loved one or their friend help because they say, well, they have to hit rock bottom.
right. While I was in treatment, because I did return to Renfrew after the filming, I returned to Renfrew. And I was in a really, really bad place. And it was interesting because it was almost as if one day I woke up on a different side of the bed. It was, it truly was. It was like an awakening or an epiphany. And it was like, once I had that, I couldn't turn back. It was like, I say to people that, I really felt like my behaviors and my thoughts, all these thoughts of like, oh, I'm so fat, I'm disgusting, were beyond my control. And I woke up one night and I realized all of a sudden I made the connection. Something had happened. And the first thing that popped in my mind was, well, if I just took off 20 pounds, well, you would see that I was hurting. And all of a sudden that day, I made that connection and I was like, I have to get out of here. I am in full control. And I haven't stopped talking to myself ever since. And it really is part of that recovery. It's really doing the opposite over and over and over and over again. At that time, I was friendly with somebody who I had gone to treatment with, and she was still very disordered. And she would come over to my house and she's like, what is recovery like? And I said, it's awful. Awful. And she's like, what do you mean it's awful? I said, it's grueling. It's painful. It's anxiety provoking. It's sad. It's depressing. She's like, okay, so I'm not really understanding. You're not really motivating me to want to recover. I said, because all of the pain and the misery and the sadness and the anxiety and everything that I feel every single day is so much more than the nothing that I felt most of my life. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, if I could get through all of that anxiety and all of that pain and that depression and realize that it didn't kill me, I felt untouchable and I was ready to do it again.
So you were feeling your feelings.
I was feeling my feelings and I realized that it didn't kill me. I didn't need to act on it. And what I also realized was that I had to be triggered. The one thing in eating disorder treatment is that I find that there's a lot of, I know we were going to talk about my career, but I was the CEO of an eating disorder treatment program during the pandemic. And I feel that we spend so much time tiptoeing around our patients because we don't want to trigger them. And immediately it's like, oh, that triggers me. I had to be triggered over and over and over again to be able to recover. I always say that our issues, those internal, all of these things that I'm dealing with that are causing me to act on, I say on the eating disorder, are my fires. Well, how do you put out a fire if there is no fire? Mm-hmm. You've got to ignite that fire to be able to extinguish it. Yeah. Yeah. And I do believe that the media, they get to decide what, so backing up just a little bit, when I decided that was it, that I knew I was ready for recovery, being in treatment for an eating disorder, and I imagine it's very similar for substance abuse, it can be very competitive. Everybody, wants to throw around, it's like, well, I lost this much weight, or I did this many diuretics, or I did this. And it's almost more popular. Recovery it can be very unpopular when you're in treatment. And when I got out, I realized that I was like, I need to make recovery popular. Mm-hmm. Like, who's coming with me? And I remember even saying that. And even in the documentary, there's a point where I stand up and I'm like, we can either there was a lot of toxicity in the milieu at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you know what? We have the ability to turn this into a positive place. Who's coming with me? You know, it was almost like Jerry Maguire and the goldfish. I'm like, who's coming with me?
And it was like very similar.
We need people to join my team, the team recovery.
It's very similar in any particular groups that have a major theme about them.
Yeah.
Because if you're going with the hard side where people are going to say, well, this is what I'm doing or not, you know, I'm trying to express this. I'm just going to say it. I have had colorectal surgery for cancer. So I was on a Facebook group for that particular group and the hardship that they had. And over, they would say, oh, I want to die, or I want to, you know, I just don't want to do this, or I can't suffer like this any longer. I'm like, I got to get out of here because this is not recovery.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, right? Because you have to exit something. You have to identify where the core problem may be, but you have to exit with dignity and respect and hope and resilience to get to another place.
You do. And you can't do it without, it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
Life is painful. It's just, it's par for the course. The one thing that I take a lot of pride in is, well, just going back just a little bit, a lot of people don't realize, they're always like, what did she do for a living? And at the time I was actually in pharmaceutical sales, but I was originally a teacher and I went back to education after treatment. And when the documentary was getting ready to premiere, I remember having to go to my principal and break it to him. And it was like, surprise.
How did he take that?
He looked very nervous. When I came back to work the next morning, I had all of these emails from parents and I thought, oh, good God, here it is. I'm going to lose my job. You know, nobody is going to want me to teach their child. And I opened up one email after another, and it almost brings me to tears because I remember, the first email I opened up said, I watched the documentary with my son last night, and I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to show him what a true role model is. So
wow.
That we all have struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes work to overcome those struggles. And I want to thank you. And all similar, very similar. So I started doing like a lot of public speaking, educating the school psychologists. Mm-hmm. And it actually was very well received. My children, of course, in the documentary were 2 and 10. And they are 23 and 31 now. So I love to, because till this day, like you said, what happened? What happened to us? And people don't know. And there are blogs where people are like, we love Alisa. Oh my gosh, she's our favorite subject. And then there are other people who see it and they're like, oh, she's so fake. She looks like whoever. And they're comparing me, right? They'll make up anything. And, what a terrible parent for having the eating disorder, and to be able to show that I have 2 beautifully successful children. Mm-hmm. My son,
but part of what you sent to me is that you want to continue to be a role model for your children and your family. And this is what is exactly, this is what it is about. Our family are
exactly
to be the role models. And so all of us as parents make mistakes, some larger than others. We're not going to keep score,
right?
Because they're all, children are resilient too. And some children will react to something really minor versus something major that somebody moves through. You don't know.
Yeah.
And we all have our cross to bear. Here I am, a Jewish woman saying a cross to bear.
We do.
But what I'm saying is that there are a lot of families that we all learn, and if we continue to improve what we're going to do for our children and our grandchildren
Yes.
and the generations past, rather than staying stuck in the situation.
We do. I have, tikkun olam in Hebrew on my arm, which for those of you who don't know, what it means is repairing the world.
Yeah.
And that's all we could do. And, I used to do a lot of public speaking, and it really invigorated me. I remember speaking, actually going back many, 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 many years ago. And I had flown I think somebody had flown me into Texas to speak to a group of struggling girls with eating disorders and males. And I remember asking at the end of my talk, and this wasn't, I said, look, this isn't to feed my ego. I said, honestly, because I bring a lot of deprecating humor to my talks. And I said, but when you look at me, what do you see? Now that we've spent a half hour, 45 minutes together, what is it that you see when you look at me? And they're raising their hands and they're like, oh my gosh, I think that you're beautiful. You're funny. You're intelligent. You're articulate. I think you're a good mom. I think and so I looked at them and I said, so if I am beautiful and intelligent and I'm funny and I'm smart and I'm all these things and I am the face of recovery, what are you so afraid of? If this is what recovery looks like, if this is what this side of the club looks like, why are you so afraid to join me? What's holding you back? And that's really, really the question. And have we mastered the treatment process like anything else?
I was just talking with Adrian and Johnny Lipscomb in my last interview in regard to getting to the core, the root, getting to the root of what caused the addiction, whether it's eating disorder, whether it's a drug, alcohol, gambling, whatever that may be, and being able to get to the core and treating that, and that there is a treatment for all addiction. Why can't we, instead of the whack-a-mole?
Yes.
We keep talking about the whack-a-mole. And I've, as a medical professional, I've known people who've had bariatric surgery for, 300, 400, 500 pounds, and they lose the weight. But I had a client who died of alcohol disorder because of the alcohol use after the bariatric surgery.
You're right on point as far as like the root of the problem. I did a lot of work over the years, and at some point I stopped going to therapy, but I would, every few years, something would come up, something in my life, and I would feel like I would need a tune-up, and I'd go back and see my therapist. And when I returned from North Carolina, after being the CEO of an eating disorder facility during the pandemic, my brain was fried. I was just, it was a 24/7 job. And I said, after all these years, I had never really truly done like the trauma work. I had said that I wanted to do it. And I remember even being in treatment, but being a parent, it was like, well, we don't know when her insurance is going to run out. We don't know if she's ready for that. And we need to be able to patch her back up and send her along the way. So we didn't do it then either. So I came back, and 2 years ago, I started doing EMDR. And I've been doing it religiously, almost like weekly for the last few years. And it's incredible how I have spent my entire life saying, no, I had, my parents were divorced, but I was too young to understand. So, but, this didn't affect me. So just realizing just how much every little.
Yeah.
I mean.
And they all add up.
They do.
Life incidences add up.
Right.
From the times that you remember things, but you don't necessarily remember the things that happened when you were between 1 and 5.
And now I'm remembering, and it's not making it any easier, but it's important to really, at least I'm able to identify
Sure.
the root of the cause.
So in the talking to the audience, to the people who are listening now, what is your biggest takeaway for them in identifying for themselves what may be going on and what they can look forward to in recovery?
To somebody who might be struggling?
Who somebody is struggling, or a family member who knows someone who's struggling, or a friend who knows somebody struggling?
I do think it was such a fine line, and we live in Florida, and we are all women in today's society. So I think sometimes we get confused. I don't want to say we, but we as a community, we
Sure.
get confused between like what's normal and what's not. But I see so often, you know, parents and mothers dieting. It's like such a like this diet culture that they're,
Mhm.
and it's if it's really about body acceptance and really working hard to identify. I mean, we need to be more compassionate because every word out of our mouths like leaves an impression not only on our children but our children's friends. And it's really about it's I'm sure a lot of people out there, or maybe a lot of people haven't heard about this, like health at every size. And there's a lot of confusion around that. And I would actually really encourage people to read the book because it doesn't mean that, you could be 800 pounds
Mhm.
and you're naturally going to be healthy. There's so much more to it. But it's really about body acceptance. What we need to recognize is that for years I aspired and I knew exactly who I wanted to look like. I had people, I remember like Jennifer Aniston. And I mean, I am 5 feet tall. I come from a family of naturally overweight people. I am a dark brunette. I have brown eyes. I have a completely different bone structure. So even if I lost all the weight in the world, I would never look like this person. So
Well, unfortunately, society has, for many years now, made it glamorous for women to actually be tiny.
right.
It's so thin
But
that
who gets to say?
But
Who?
I don't even know how it started. I can look back at it, but I just looked at a documentary on Ava Gabor,
Hmm.
and she wasn't thin. She wasn't gorgeous.
No.
There was, but she was one of the most successful actresses in her time. But she isolated because of of people just coming at her and the expectations that they had of her. That I think there's so many people that are unhappy in life that they just want to grasp onto someone else in their success
Yeah.
and say, well, they'll either say you're gorgeous or they'll say, oh my God, you need to lose weight, or you're too thin, or there is so much for women to look at. And as you say, in South Florida, there's a lot of plastic surgery here. And I look at some women, unfortunately, they were gorgeous in their day, but with the plastic surgery, they don't look so gorgeous.
Right.
So, what can we do to accept who we are as we are?
You're asking me for the. Oh my gosh! I think if I had that answer,
I'm just putting it out there to the universe.
Yeah, I know. I think that we have to keep speaking about like body positivity. The one thing that I said was I remember back, on the front of People magazine. It was the Olsen twins and Keira Knightley. And they were really, you could tell they were really struggling at the time. And this is who they put on the front of People magazine. And then I was asked to do an interview for People magazine. And this is when I had a little bit of a tiff with the director from Thin. And they had called me and I said, I don't want to talk about my story. And they said, but this is what sells. I call it the gory story. I said, it's not, because do you remember when Jennifer Lopez first became very popular? She was very curvy and she was known for her much larger like hips and rear end. And I remember saying, if you would put Jennifer Lopez back on the front of that magazine, that is what would sell. That is what girls would aspire to look like.
Right.
They are going to buy. You have such influence in Hollywood. Out in LA, you have the ability to sell whatever it is you want, but this is what you choose to sell. Young girls are going to aspire to grasp onto
Pretty
whatever
sad.
it is that you give them.
Yeah.
And you have the ability to make it popular. I mean, I remember a silly analogy. My daughter was in middle school and she figure skated and she had what was called a Zuka bag. They come from like Switzerland. They were developed because backpacks were too heavy for, they were realizing they were affecting kids. So Zuka bags is what all of the kids would use. It's like this box almost, and it opens up and it's on wheels. And the figure skaters would use it to carry their skates and their uniforms and everything in, and they would wheel it around. So I said to my daughter, I said, why don't you, she was tired of carrying a backpack in middle school and she had gone to the small private school. I said, bring your Zuka bag to school. And she was so embarrassed. I mean, for my being an introvert, she was she was so painfully shy. I said, bring your Zuka bag to school. Absolutely not. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. She did it. And every kid started buying a Zuka bag. I mean, this was like the most ridiculous looking thing.
She became the influencer.
They could, and every kid in that private school had a Zuka bag. It's amazing how we could be trendsetters if we have the courage to do so. If we,
that's what we should inspire today.
Yes.
Not should, can inspire today. That we can inspire the trend setting of women who are voluptuous, but yet whoever they are in their own voluptuous way.
Yes.
Because who's to say what body is supposed to be, beautiful or not? And let's look at everyone individually.
Yeah. As an introvert, I'm not the person who naturally just comes out and is constantly complimenting people. But leading teams of employees, I remember years ago, I had my entire team read How to Win Friends and Influence People. What did that book come out like in the 50s, 60s? It is so old. Oh, it is an old one. And this was just a few years ago. And they hated it. And I would have them read a chapter and then come back and talk about how they applied it that week. And one of the chapters is about just paying somebody a compliment. I said, go into an office and pay somebody a compliment. And they're like, but what if I said, tell the person that you like their eyeshadow or that their eyeshadow looks nice on them. I said, it's not being disingenuous. I said, because that person wore that shirt that you might think is ugly or that eyeshadow that you might think is ugly. They wore it because they felt confident, because they liked it. Reinforce that. Let them know that they look nice.
Right.
Let people know that they look nice.
We do that for little children. Why can't we do it as adults?
Yeah.
So let's send that message out.
Right. Paying it forward.
Well, thank you, Alisa. I appreciate you coming and happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Enjoy your birthday dinner tonight. And I really appreciate this conversation.
Oh, I appreciated being here. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you for joining the conversation today. If you are seeking help for yourself or a loved one, please reach out to our Feinberg Consulting team at 248-538-5425. That's 248-538-5425. And check out our website at feinbergcare.com. I'm grateful for our guests and all who have joined us today. Make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to podcasts.